Hey, what's up, everyone? Morey here, and today we're going to be talking about the most common muscle compensations and how they impact your sprinting. I'm really excited about this video. We're going to go into the lower cross syndrome. We're going to talk about flat feet, tightness in the back. We're also be talking about like the rounded shoulders or stiffness within the mid back, and then also talking about stiffness and tightness within the ankles. I think those are really the most common things that we'll see. We'll go a little bit more in depth into different things that come from those 5 areas, but we really want to get specific into some of the things that we'll see very commonly within athletes that are impacting the sprinting, so then you can identify this within your own sprinting or in your own body to make it so you can make the necessary changes to make it so you can run faster. So at the end of this video, you want to be able to understand what are these muscle compensations, how are they impacting you, and what are some of the things that you could do to make it so you could address these issues and therefore be able to improve your speed. I'm going to be showing a video as we do this of a runner who is running with a lot of good technique, a lot of things that they're doing really well, but we could see a very good understanding of what they're doing within their body as they're running. So then we could see what muscles are going to be turned on, what muscles are going to be turned off, things like that, which I think will be beneficial in being able to identify the main things that we're going to be talking about today. First thing let's talk about is the lower cross syndrome. There's so many things that go into this and we could stem out of. Essentially what this is going into is the hip flexors and the back, as well as the core and the like hamstrings, glutes. And the idea is if one part of your body is active or working a lot, typically we'll see a lot of people that are tight within their hip flexors, and then they're also tight within their lower back. So there's like that cross between the back as well as the hip flexors, and then there'll be weakness within the core, weakness within the hamstrings and glutes. That's the most common example of it. The first thing that typically happens that makes that an issue is a weakness within like that lower core, your TVA, as well as like your psoas muscle, which is a hip flexor. And a lot of people want to do when they have this tight hip flexor is really try to stretch it a lot more. And a lot of times that ends up not being the solution. When you have a lot of stiffness there, a lot of times it ends up being from a weakness within, again, that lower core hip flexor. And so instead of working on the range of motion or trying to stretch it, what really you should be doing is strengthening that muscle to make it so then we can get a stronger hip flexor, stronger core. And so what that'll do is make it so then we'll open up within the stride. So typically what we'll see is people that are weak within the hip flexors, they don't get as much height within the knee, and they also don't get as much extension within the leg. So we can see where this athlete does a really good job. He or she does a really good job of really extending here within the front side. So if you're really stiff and tight in those hip flexors, typically you're also not able to get very much range in your hamstrings. And so again, if we can strengthen within the hip flexor and within that lower core, that will help open up that range within the hamstring. And so what we want to be able to kind of showcase here is what are these compensations and how are they impacting you? Because you might only be feeling tight hamstrings and not realize, oh, my hamstring is really tight because of the weakness in the hip flexors, weakness in that lower core. And so I want to help you identify, okay, this is why this could be happening. And so what we'll also end up a lot of times seeing is like a hyperextension within the lower back where you can really see the pelvis start to kind of roll forward a little bit more. That's also a good indication that we're going to have a lot of lower back tightness and also limited range within the hamstrings. We'll also see a lot of times a lot of tightness and stiffness within the calf. And especially for people that are pretty fast that still have this going on, then they're using a lot of the push off within the lower leg because there's just not as much range in those hips. So just because you have this doesn't mean you are inherently slow. You could still be fast and have a compensation going on within the body. And a lot of times people that are the most athletic are people that are really good at being able to kind of hide those compensations within the body. The issue is eventually that ends up showing itself. And then if you don't address it properly, you don't know how to address it, then that could end up going into reoccurring injuries. And so that's what we kind of want to be able to take a look at here is how can we improve your performance, but also what are some things that we could do to make it so we could potentially limit injuries that can be easily identified for athletes, especially as you're getting older. And a lot of times, unfortunately, people, when you're 16, 17, you might not be watching this video because you haven't had a lot of injuries. But a lot of times, I'm assuming that a lot of these people that are watching it have maybe had different injuries and want to be able to identify what can I do to make it so I don't have my hamstring pull or my groin pull or, having these lower body issues. And you get in the right place. We're going to go over all that type of stuff. And I would say if the hamstring ends up being an issue, a great thing to be able to consider is how can we strengthen the hip flexor, get more length in the hip flexor, and we'll give a couple exercises here to kind of show you how we can strengthen the hip flexor and also improve the range of motion in the hamstring simultaneously, which will help you in being able to better access that muscle when you're sprinting, when you're running. And there's some things within the mechanics that you could obviously address as well. Again, one of the things that we'll also see within people that have that kind of lower cross syndrome, the tightness in the lower back and the tightness within the hip flexors, is a lot of overuse within the calves. A lot of times there's big calves because they're trying to push off so much as they're running rather than using those hip flexors. So the stronger we can get within the hip flexors, then the better you're going to be able to run, the faster you're going to be able to run, and the more you're going to be able to utilize your hips. You want to be able to use both your hips as well as the calves as you are sprinting, or the lower leg as you're sprinting. The next one is going to be having flat feet. And so what that essentially is being stuck in a pronated position. There's obviously going to be some people that are more predisposed to having a flatter foot because of some of the things that we have within the bones. So you may end up having your bones in a position that just make your foot flat. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of people that are really fast, Usain Bolt being the primary example, who are flat footed. The thing is when you have a flat foot, you have to put more time into strengthening the arch of the foot and also strengthening the glute med, the lateral stabilizer within the hip. So what will typically happen for people that have flat feet, and why it ends up being potentially dangerous, is you'll end up being a little bit more subject to having limited balance, right? And so when you have that limited balance, what that means is when that foot's striking the ground, right? So during this foot strike, there'll end up being a longer time before we get back into push-off. So we can see as this foot's striking the ground, there's a lot of activity happening within that lower leg. And also, here we'll go on the other side, and also within that lateral glute, right? So this is the lateral glute right here, glute med, right? And then we have all the lateral quad muscles as well. And then again, obviously the peroneals, calves, things like that. These are all very active during that foot strike because they're trying to stabilize all the force that's getting generated into the ground. And so if we don't have the necessary strength in these muscles, what will happen is that then there'll be an excessive amount of collapsing happening within the foot, which will make it so then it takes a long time for us to be able to push back off the ground. And a lot of times that will end up leading to the overuse within the hamstring. So what I would say, if you have reoccurring hamstring issues, what I would look at first is what are we doing during foot strike and how can we improve that? Because I would make the argument, especially if you have flat feet, I would make the argument that you are landing and not properly stabilizing the landing. So then when you're pushing off in a very extended position and therefore creating overuse within the hamstring. And again, a lot of times what we'll see in people that have flat feet is excessive extension within the back. And then also a lot of times we'll even actually see limited glute activation as well. So very much relying on the hamstring muscles and the calf muscles and not utilizing the glute and the hips. And a lot of times that ends up being because the hip will end up being out of place. And again, this is something that you could be predisposed to, right? We could end up having and being born with our hips in a position that's going to be a little bit more anteriorly tilted. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of great athletes that have that. But if you don't do the necessary training or strengthen necessary muscles, that could also make it so then it could be a problem for you. It can make it so then you're not able to properly utilize the glute because you're so quick to, when you have that anterior tilt, what will end up happening is you end up being very quick to start utilizing the lower back because you're already in such a large range of motion within the hips. Where if you have more of a neutral hip position, as that foot or as your hip goes back, now you're going to have more easy access to the glute muscle. But if you're already in this position and then you go further back, now that's going to immediately go into your back unless you do the necessary exercises to be able to make it so you can get better at activating the glute. And these are like just bridges, things where you can really stabilize that hip position, making sure that you have a good stable hip and also have a strong glute med and make sure that the muscles within the hip are working in a functional way is going to help you in making it so then you don't get into that type of problem. Flat feet, a lot of times though, is going to be, it's a normal compensation. You can't necessarily do a ton of things to be able to make it so you don't have flat feet. Again, it could be a great thing for you because as you're landing, and I've made a video about this, as you're landing, you can also have a lot of benefit because you immediately will want to shift your weight to the inside. There's people that have high arches or just don't use their foot as well, which as their foot hits the ground, they're more likely to keep all of their weight on the outside part of the foot. And therefore, as the foot comes off the ground, are not going to be able to get the same type of internal rotation and activation within the leg, right? Because as this foot comes off the ground, we want to have that heel kind of coming inward. So you can see as they're landing, this person's a little bit wide here with their foot position. And again, this is probably somebody that is a little bit more flat-footed. This is another compensation that'll end up happening. But we can see the foot was more turned out. And then what happens is as that foot hits, we get that heel to come up in the air. And then as it's coming off the ground, we're going to be getting internal rotation of the leg, which is going to kind of force this heel to go out to the side. So if you end up having more of your weight on the outside part of the foot, then as the foot comes off the ground, then you're going to end up twisting the opposite way, going more into external rotation, which is going to limit how much you can totally access the glute, access the hamstrings, where when you get that internal rotation of the leg, that's what creates a lot of that power during the push off. And again, just makes it so now you could be very quick with the leg cycle because now you're pushing forward with your big toe, right? So if you get your heel up and you're pushing off the big toe or the most inside part of your foot, that's going to give you more of that direct line. Where if you're more on the pinky toe, this is going to be my big toe for this example. This is my pinky toe. If I'm pushing here, I'm pushing away. But if I'm pushing here, I'm pushing right towards you. So the idea is let's try to push more off of the big toe. And if you're flat-footed, you're a lot more likely to be able to do that. So the push off is not usually an issue, but it just ends up being the timing of the push off. It's that it happens too late into the sprint, where the faster you could be. If you watch again Usain Bolt running, he does a great job of landing. He goes into, he pronates, he collapses within the foot, but then he immediately comes right back off, which is why he had such a great fast turnover and such a limited foot contact time, is because he still had that strength within the foot and strength within the glutes to make it so he was able to still run fast. So that's a big thing with the flat feet. And I would even work on the balance. Work on your balance with the heel up. Again, work on the glute strength, things like that. It's going to help you in being able to still run fast even with a flat foot. So another great thing to be able to test your overall sprinting capability is just how well can you extend in the back. So if you're just laying on your stomach, just lifting up your chest and being able to do that effectively is a great test of health within your lower back. So if you can't do that, then that's definitely something that you want to be able to improve on. And typically what will end up happening when you don't have the extension within the back is now we're not going to have the same type of functionality within the glutes and the hamstrings. So that just means we don't have extension within our lower body. We're very much trying to utilize the flexion of our body. We could still have a strong core. We could still be able to run some degree of fast just because of quick turnover, right? This is where we see people that will have like really fast leg cycles, but won't be able to pick up a lot of distance because they're not able to really open up the stride. A lot of times that goes into a limited extension within the back. We have to be able to have the range both to be able to touch our toes and have that ability to open up within the hamstrings, but we also need the ability to really lift up our shoulders to get the extension within the lower back as well to be able to run fast. And so what we want to be able to understand is if we don't have the right degree of extension within the back, we want to be able to strengthen the core like we already talked about, but also get specific into how we are training the glutes and really slow down some of the movements. What I would say is if you don't have good range of motion within that part of your body, one, you could train it, you could definitely work on it, but there might be people that are a little bit older or very sensitive to any type of extension within the back. And for those people, you have to really slow down glute bridges and hip extension type of movements to make it so then you can get very focused action where you're maintaining a good posterior tilt as you are activating within the glute, which means that as your foot, it would be coming back here, we wouldn't want to be able to get too much into extension in the hip too early. You'd want to be able to maintain the hip being underneath the best that you can while you are going into extension within a glute bridge or with any type of glute movement. So you could really focus on activating within that upper hamstring, lower glute, and take some of the pressure off of your lower back. And then as that starts to open up, hopefully we can start to get better extension within the back, which will make it so then you can improve your speed. So a big compensation is definitely limited lower back range of motion, limited extension within the back. The next one's going to be stiff ankles. Okay, so what this looks like is just not being able to do a overhead squat. So if you are in a position with a bar up overhead and just squatting down and you really fall forward with your hands a good amount. Typically, I mean, that can end up being mid back as well, which we'll go into next. But a lot of times that ends up being stiffness within the ankles, the inability to get quality dorsiflexion within the ankle. And this can also be seen in flat feet. It could also be seen in people that are weak within the hip flexor. Some of you guys might have a multitude of these things. And what you just want to be able to do is kind of prioritize where you are on it. We all are to some extent kind of battling all of this stuff, right? So you want to be able to, your body's kind of going in between having too flat feet or having a strong arch or having stiff hip flexors or stronger glutes or having or lack of hamstring range of motion or having good ankle range of motion or not having good ankle range of motion. So in order for you to continue to run faster and maintain great health, you have to continue to work on getting better ankle range of motion if that is something that you really struggle with. You're very tight within your Achilles, if you maybe have plantar fasciitis, if you've had like shin splints, things like that, those are all essentially warning signs that you have limited range of motion within the ankles and need to work on the range of motion within the ankles to make it so then you can improve the speed. And the reason this is so important really goes into both sides, both the dorsiflexion, being able to get plenty of reach so we could see really good job of being able to lift up within the toes, gets plenty of range of motion there within the dorsiflexors. Anterior tibialis is the name of the muscle there as you're going through and getting that reach there. And you could see he or she's getting really good activation within those muscles as we're getting the reach prior to then pulling back underneath. So you want to be able to get great dorsiflexion in the foot, but then we also want to be able to get great plantar flexion, which is going to be the opposite side of that, and being able to get great extension going back. And typically you can't be good with one without being good with the other one. So if you don't have good dorsiflexion or ability to lift up the toe, then you're not going to have great plantar flexion or the ability to push the toe all the way back. And that's where the true range of motion happens when it comes to sprinting, is how much range do you have within the ankle. So if you don't have enough range with your dorsiflexion, then you're not going to be able to get the same degree of height within the knee. You're not going to be able to get the same type of extension within the leg, right? We can see again, this person's at full speed. Look at how much extension they have in their leg prior to foot strike. Okay. What that means is they have plenty of dorsiflexion within the ankle, right? You have to be able to maintain great extension there in order to effectively strike the ground, okay? And you're not going to be able to get great extension in your ankle if you don't have great plantar flexion or ability to extend within the ankle or within the foot as well. So you want to be able to have both of those and understand that in order for you to truly open up the stride, it has a lot to do with the range of motion within the foot, within the ankle. Once you can start to get the full range of motion within the foot, then you're going to be able to run a lot faster. So again, some of these things end up being really important when it comes to having the right range of motion within the hip flexors and the glutes and everything like that. But a big part of how well you're going to be able to run has to do with the range that you have within the ankle and what you're doing within the foot when you're running. So maybe you have good range when you're doing an overhead squat or when you're doing a calf raise or whatever, but when you're actually running, you may be doing doing some type of inversion or eversion. I see this a lot with people where they'll be kind of turning their foot in or doing something that's making it so the range of their sprint ends up being limited because of what they're doing within their foot. So at the end of the day, in order for you to properly apply this stuff into your running, you have to be able to work on it within the foot. Now, you have to also work on these other areas. It's equally as important, right? The strength within the hip flexors, the hamstring range of motion, the back range of motion, the balance, all that stuff ends up being important, because if you don't and you just start working with the foot range of motion, I've seen this happen before. That's why I'm giving you a warning here. If you just start improving your foot range when you're running without doing the necessary exercises that coincide with that, you can end up having an overuse injury very quickly, especially within the hamstrings, because your body's not used to getting into these ranges. So all of a sudden you go from a poor running mechanics, which are maybe limited within your hamstring range or your hamstring activation, right? You don't have the hamstring strength within the current sprinting form. Well, then you start to run with the correct hamstring range of motion and the correct foot activation. And if you don't have the strength there, again, that's what you're going to end up having, that overuse injury. So just be aware that what you're doing here, it wants to be a slow, gradual improvement. You don't need to necessarily go from having a lot of these issues to all of a sudden going and having perfect form. You want to be able to really concentrate on the form and build up the muscle there before you go into full sprinting, because especially for multiple reps, because of what could end up happening within the overuse. So just a warning there. It shouldn't happen for most people. I just want to give a warning because I don't know where you are exactly are at in terms of your running mechanics and your running form. And so I think it's helpful to be able to understand, okay, I probably need to be able to work on some of these parts of my body to get them stronger before I go and run, 10 or 15 sprints with a completely different running. The last thing is going to be the mid back and the kind of the rounded shoulders. And so that's going to end up you're going to see that in the extension in the arm. So if you don't have great extension when your arm's coming back, you're not utilizing the lat, you're not utilizing the mid back, then what you're going to end up doing is, again, you're going to have a limited ability to access the opposite side of that, which is going to be the flexion within the leg. So what you want to be able to be aware of with the arm swing is the more strength and power you create within the arm swing, pulling it back, then the more balance and body control you're going to have. So you have to be able to pull that hand back, pull that elbow back with a lot of power going here to make it so then we can utilize that in bringing the leg all the way forward and through. If we're not getting good extension within the arm, we're not going to be able to work on the front side. And what ends up being a big contributor to, I think, running speed, if you watch the top athletes in the world, typically what they're doing is they're spending 2 to 1 in terms of the amount of time. So if we just say 0.3 seconds, a lot of times it's around 0.3 seconds in terms of how much time their foot is off the ground, right? So within that 0.3 seconds, 0.1 of that time is going to be in backside. So very quick to get the foot up, to get the leg through. As much as they still have a good range of motion, it happens very quickly. Again, 0.1 seconds, and we're talking about a third of a second, right? So a second happens very quickly, obviously. We're talking about a third of a second, and then breaking that down even further to 0.1. So a tenth of a second is what happens in the backside, around a tenth of a second, maybe 0.13, somewhere like that. But still very quick with the amount of time spent in the backside, where the front side is closer to 0.2. Okay, so they're spending more time going here because this is where we could pick up distance, and it's also where we set ourselves up for foot strike. So if you are spending more time here, then as you're landing, then you end up landing in a very reactionary position, which means that when your foot hits the ground, right, if you spend too much time here, maybe 0.2 here, then 0.1, then when your foot hits the ground, it's not prepared for optimal force production. So then that's where you end up having a lot more time spent on the ground, which makes it so then you have more time spent in the backside, which then makes it so the cycle just continues to happen within the running. And then that's where you end up having the hamstring type of issues, where when you have more time spent in the front side, then we can get adequately prepared for the foot strike. So then it's not a reaction, but it's something that we're actually prepared for. We prepared our body for the foot strike, which makes us so then we can continue to build speed, because now the next foot strike, we're going to be able to keep on building, keep on building, keep on building. So a lot of times people that will end up having that longer foot strike, they might be very quick at the beginning because they're creating so much push, so much activation within the backside, but they're also very quick to kind of top out. Christian Coleman's a really good example. Such a great push at the very beginning, has so much strength within the hamstrings within the back, but is very quick to get to his top speed and then kind of dies out because he doesn't have that range on the front side, where you could see somebody like Noah Lyles, not as quick at the beginning, not as good with his push off, but he's so strong on the front side that as he gets into his top speed, that's really where he can generate more force, more force, more force. He keeps on building speed, building speed, building speed. Letsili Tobogo is another good example. A lot of those top sprinters all have very, very good front side mechanics because of what you have to in order to run fast. And again, a lot of what happens within the front side comes from that great extension pulling back. I've done a lot of videos with Noah Lyles. You can see how much extension he gets with his arms. And I see a lot of people that are not able to run as fast. And a lot of times it just, their hands don't get far enough back at all. There's no wrist action. There's no movement there. And because of that, it's just hard to be able to run as quickly if you don't have the necessary muscle activation. So you can see as the arm is pulling all the way back, so you can see the right arm is pulling all the way back, there's a lot of activation that's happening in the opposite lower back. And then they don't show the lat here. This is a deeper level of the lat, but we can see there's a lot of activation happening here. We can see activation within the tricep. And if we could see the lat, it would be the lat as well. And that's what ends up happening, is there's like this activation all the way through here as that foot is coming off the ground. And then that allows us to then be able to get the range and the proper angles to then drive straight forward and through as we're going into the extension on the other side. So again, the more extension you get within the arms, then the better that's going to open up for the other side to be able to come through, to make it so then we can create that, like this lever system where one side is getting maximum range and then transitioning to the other side, getting maximum range, getting maximum activation. If you're not getting the full range within the arms, the full activation within the arms, within the lats, within the mid back, within the contralateral side or opposite side lower back, within the opposite side glute, then you're just not going to be able to run as fast, right? You want to be able to, especially when you get to your top speed, be maximally contracting these muscles, and not necessarily by focusing on the contraction of these muscles, but just because you have such a great connection to the tissue that you're going to be utilizing when you're sprinting, right? So you have great connection with the hip flexors, the glutes, the core, all those things that end up being important, calves. And so when you naturally have that, or if you built that up, I guess you wouldn't have that naturally, you'd have to build it. So you've built up that connection. Now that allows you to be able to work within the maximum range, which makes it so then you can push off with all the force, you can strike the ground with all the force. And that's how you end up running fast, is by understanding how to have control and also maximal contraction of these muscle groups that are critical for your sprinting speed. And so that ends up being really what we're trying to talk about here. We're trying to show you here is what are some of the muscle compensations and how do those apply to running, and hopefully we'll make it so you can understand, okay, these are things that I want to be able to stay away from. A big thing too with the middle back issue, if you have tightness in that middle back or more that rounded shoulder position, is then you're going to have that forward head lean, which is going to make it so then you're limited in the amount of back extension that you have going back into, that. So that compensation ends up being an issue. If you are too far forward with your head, now you're not going to be able to get extension in your back going back because your body's stuck in that forward head lean. So if you don't have great back extension, we've already talked about that, but that also ends up being a big problem, is you'll be stuck with that head being forward, which is going to make it so then you are just stuck with a ineffective body position, body alignment, which is going to impact your ability to access the right muscles. So I hope you guys liked this video. I know that it went in depth into a lot of different things. Wanted to be able to just talk about sprinting and present something that is hopefully beneficial for you. So if you have any questions, would be happy to answer them for you. I'm going to try to give you as much visual details as possible. Probably added in some exercises, things like that as well. But if you have any additional questions in regards to exercises, we'll be happy to help you out with that. As always, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. You can check out some of the other videos that we have that go in depth into different parts of your sprinting, and we'll talk to you soon.